So welcome to those of you mochurch.tv. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 18. You can download the Bible app for free. We'll be in the NIV, New International Version. Matthew chapter 18. So I don't know if you've ever been to an arcade. How many of you have ever played the WhackaMole game? Anybody? A round of applause. Okay, nobody ever wants to. You just find yourself there. It's like eating at Denny's. Like, I didn't mean to be here. It just happened. But yeah, there's this whack-a-mole game where these moles pop up, and there's usually like 5 or 7 or 10, and they can pop up, and you just have this like, I don't know, this cushiony mallet that you're supposed to hit them on the head with. And then they start popping up 2 at a time. You're like, bang, bang. And then they pop up 2 at a bang, bang. Then 3 at a time. And you just have to keep up. I hate it. It's such a stupid game. It's nothing but stress. All you're doing is banging away at these moles, hitting them on the head. And they just pop up as fast as you can knock them out until the game is over. Not fun to me at all. Just stressful. But when I think about the whack-a-mole game, I'm like, there's kind of an analogy to be made there for what we've been talking about the last few weeks. We're in the 4th week of a series called the F-Bomb about forgiveness, extending forgiveness to those who have hurt us. But when you think about all of your relationships, it's almost like you need a whack-a-mole strategy for forgiveness in relationships. Because you've got all this stuff that's come from your childhood and your preteen and teen years and your first marriage and, just all these different things that are thoughts that pop up, painful memories from the past that you kind of have to have a whack-a-mole strategy with. And then even in your current relationships, I mean, people are humans. Your siblings are still going to hurt you. Your spouse, they aren't perfect, so they're going to hurt you in ways. Your coworkers, your boss, your parents, your children, your grandchildren, all these things in relationships, there's just always going to be a need to bang, okay, bang, yeah, then there was this bang. You're going to have to be like in a constant strategy with a whack-a-mole forgiveness thing going on. And so in life, it's like you have to be able to take care of these painful memories, even if it was from an hour ago or yesterday. You got to have some way to deal with this because it's always popping up. Hurtful things and memories are always popping up. And here's the deal. It's not, unfortunately, as simple as just saying, I'm not going to think about that. Bam, bam, I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to think about it because we've talked about this in the series. That's just stuffing. That's just putting, not the Thanksgiving kind. That's delicious. Okay, that's good stuffing. But this is like what we talked about, holding a beach ball under the water. It's going to burst out eventually when you just stuff or disregard your emotions. That's not healthy at all. And so we have to have some way to deal with this, a whack-a-mole strategy of forgiveness that isn't just stuffing our feelings and saying, not going to think about it, not going to think about it, not going to think about it. It's over, it's in the past, it's done. It has to be something else. So we learned the first week that forgiveness is releasing my enemies from their debts. Just in case you weren't here, that's really what we've been talking about is there's a debt when someone hurts you that you feel like they owe you something, whether it's an apology or a marriage or a childhood. And so it means releasing them. But there's still these painful memories. Even when you choose to say, I release them, you're still going to have these painful memories pop up because it is what it is, right? Those things happen. So you have to have a strategy on how to deal with that. And today, I'm going to give you something that I think is really, really practical on how to deal with that. Kind of a whack-a-mole strategy for forgiveness that you'll be able to put into action if you choose to whenever these painful thoughts pop up. So in 1949, there was a Canadian psychologist whose name was Donald Hebb. And he wrote a book, published a book that was really a groundbreaking book in the fields of psychology and neuroscience. And so one of the things that came out of that book and out of his research on learning and memory was kind of an axiom, a proverb, if you will, a saying that you could sum up in one sentence, and it's called Hebs Axiom. And it says this: neurons that fire together, wire together. Now, neurons, brain cells, okay, like the thing that Snoop Dogg doesn't have much left of, Keith Richards, they don't have many of those left, but a neuron is a brain cell. Oh, this is going to be a tough service. Tryptophan, what is it? Like, what's going on here, okay? Leftovers, you still eat, and then you're like, whoo, I had 2 turkey sandwiches before I came. All right, so a neuron, brain cell, we'll just say for layman's terms, when they fire together, they wire together. Meaning something happens, and then you react in this way, your body feels this way, you choose then to make this choice based on this feeling. Well, every time that happens, you create a pathway of neurons firing together, and then they wire together. They make a path. They connect. They make a highway that you're likely to go down every time you feel that same feeling. And so that's Hebs Axiom. It's this pattern, this pathway that develops. And whenever we repeat that activity, I felt this way, so I did this. I felt this way, so I did this. We create like a neural template in our brain. We create a groove in our brains. And so it's kind of like those old, connect the dots when you were a kid. And you'd go start with 1, you connect it to 2, connect it to 3. And, that's the same thing is like, well, once you create that pathway, that neural pathway, that it's kind of like, once I head to 1 and go to 2, it's almost like, how this is going to end. I'm going to end up in the same place, doing the same thing. In other words, neurons that repeatedly activate in a particular pattern are statistically more likely to fire in that same pattern the more they're activated. There's a Christian psychiatrist named Kurt Thompson. I read his book last year. It's called Anatomy of the Soul. I definitely recommend it. And he puts it this way. He says it's kind of like you and a bunch of people behind you are trying to go through this thick jungle. And you pull out your Jason Voorhees machete and you start hacking through this jungle. And people come behind you and they're hacking with you. You're not too close, but come behind me. And you get through, then you're hacking through, you're making a pathway through this jungle. And once you go through the jungle and create this pathway, then anyone who would come after you, well, one, they wouldn't need a machete because here's this path. And as soon as they enter the path, they're very unlikely, statistically, at any point during this journey to go off of that path, right? They're very unlikely to say, you know what, I'm going to take a machete halfway through this pathway and I'm going to go this direction in the jungle. Once they start down that path, they're likely to stay on it all the way till the end. And that really is just an illustration of Hebs Axiom. Neurons that fire together, wire together. You start here with this feeling, I felt kind of ashamed right there, just the way she looked at me. Then you head down this mental pathway that leads to the choices that you often make when you feel shame or whatever. So in other words, this whole concept is just another way of saying it's memory. This is memory. This is how memory works. I mean, when we remember something, we're just firing neurons that have fired together before, and then we're like, I remember this. And so the more frequently they fire together, the easier it will be for them to fire together in the future. That's why it's really easy for you if you make spaghetti every week to remember the ingredients without consulting anything because you made spaghetti last week. And so you make spaghetti, you whip that up. But when the holidays come around and you're like, oh, Mom's coming to town, here's this dish I haven't made in 3 years, or this holiday sweet treat, then you have to consult a cookbook, right? Because you're just not used to over and over doing this thing, so you need some help. That's your memory. That's because that highway hasn't really been ingrained in your mind. It's this, then this, then this, then this. And so much of what we do is really just the repetition of what we've done in the past. And it creates a neural template that we can just easily remember and follow in the future. In fact, these patterns, of course, they begin the first time that we do anything, when we're kids, And so there's a mental health expert whose name, he's a radio personality too, his name is Dr. John Deloney. And he says this is a great counseling one-liner. Your childhood tragedies become your adult biologies. So when you experience pain as a kid, the way that you respond as a kid begins to create this neural template for how you will respond to the same kind of embarrassment or hurt or feeling ashamed. Man, the smallest thing can trigger it, can't it? Like, it might just be a look you think someone gives you. And it might trigger the way you always responded to that as a kid. And so that becomes a groove in your brain, and that becomes your default. That's Hebs Axiom. But John Deloney's boss, Dave Ramsey at Ramsey Solution, he always jokes and says this: after the age of 30, you can't blame your parents anymore. Okay, think about that. Like he's kind of joking, and of course this is just a symbolic number. But what he's saying is, you've had plenty of time to overcome. Quit blaming mom for the thing that she always said. Quit blaming dad for the look he gave you when you got a B on your report card. Quit blame. Like once you're 32 years old, like man, come on. You've had time to create some new grooves. To say, okay, I'm going to take my machete onto the path, not at my dad or my mom. I'm going to take my machete and I'm going to go a different direction. I started here, but nope, I'm going to go in a different place than the place that I always go to. You can choose to become a victor instead of a victim. To quit blaming your parents for everything in the past and say, I have had time to work on this and to change the way that I think. Neurons that fire together, wire together. So that's going to take some work. Now, how does this work in everyday life? Whenever something triggers a painful memory, you see something, you hear something, it reminds you of something that was bad in the past or hurtful in the past, an old friendship, your first marriage, whatever it might be. And these feelings of hurt pop up. Someone was disloyal, insensitive, immature, irresponsible, abusive, selfish, whatever it is. Then you have this neural pathway. And if it doesn't end in a positive way, say forgiveness, and we'll get there, if it doesn't end there, then it can end in something that we always go to, like an addictive behavior or behavioral addictions, okay? So it could be like substance addictions or behavioral addictions. And this is what it would look like. And we hardly think twice about it because this is our memory. We've created a highway in our brain toward this reaction that we're choosing. So the brain... the pain is triggered, I get a memory, I get a thought, and I act out in anger because that's what I always do when I feel stupid or whatever it is. So I act out in anger, or I immerse myself in work, or I begin cleaning and organizing. It's a behavioral addiction. This is how I respond. I'm obsessively neat because I'm dealing with shame or whatever it is. Or pain is triggered, so I open a bottle of wine. Or I pour a shot, or I mix a cocktail, or I buy a bag of weed, or I turn to porn, or I go to the casino, or I place a bet, or I get some scratch-off lottery tickets. And that's what I go to when I'm stressed, or what happens when I'm triggered. Or the pain is triggered and I shop. The pain is triggered and I eat chocolate. I mean, it could be so many different things that are unhealthy or destructive. And that's just because I'm so used to doing that. Neurons that fire together, they wire together, so I always go to scratching off. That's what I do. Or it can even be ways that we turn to people that are unhealthy. If I'm triggered by hurt in one relationship, I might find someone new, the next person, who will make me feel better. So it's a relational thing. Or it might be saying, man, I get on social media and I beg people to tell me I'm pretty because I had a bad day. And that's not what I say, but I know what to say on social media to get a bunch of people to say, oh, but you're beautiful, you're this, you're that. And that is the thing that I turn to help me to feel better when I feel this thing, the thing that I started with. So Hebs Axiom, I'm looking for gratification because I'm not dealing with the hurt, and so I end up going down the same highway to cope that I always go down. So when our pain, our past, our hurt, our anger pops up, Hebs Axiom shows us why every choice is so important. Why it's so important to say, I'm not going to keep going down that same path, because we create patterns, habits, highways in our brain that say, this is where I'm headed. Every time I feel this, I go here. Every time I feel this and it's triggered, I go that direction to deal with this wound or to cope with it. So turn to Matthew chapter 18. We'll look at it in a Bible app. Jesus is talking to some of his disciples, and the most outspoken disciple is Peter, or Simon Peter. And I'm so thankful he puts his foot in his mouth so much, because we learn so much from what Jesus says to respond to Simon Peter when he puts his foot in his mouth. There's so many teachings we have because Simon Peter said something that was not quite right, or he asked a dumb question. And so we're like, thank you, Peter. We should all be like, thank you, Simon Peter, okay? Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? And he offers his own answer, up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, this is really interesting because in Judaism, the Jewish rabbis of that day, the spiritual leaders, there was a consensus among them that you were to forgive your brother or sister, you could forgive them 3 times. Okay, they do it once. Okay, you got a couple more, buddy, but I'm logging this. You do it twice. All right, really starting to hack me off now. 3. Okay, I'm gritting my teeth through this one. But the rabbis taught, once the 4th time happened, no soup for you. Okay, you are done. Once that happens, you're done. Like the 4th, you're off the hook. You don't have to forgive this moron anymore because they've done it 4 times. Like, okay, 4 strikes and you're out, all right? 4 strikes, you're out. And so, that, I mean, we all know, Simon Peter's mentality, the Jewish rabbi's mentality. The easiest thing to do when someone sins against you is what? Keep track. That is the easiest thing to do. Oh, I'm counting. I went to her house and she said it again. She said it again. I'm like, oh my gosh. Every time I wear this shirt, she says this, that kind of thing. And so that's 1, that's 2, and you're just counting. Oh, I can't wait to get to 4 because this mother's gone, okay? So Simon Peter, what's funny is he volunteers the idea of, should I forgive my brother or sister up to 7 times? But he's probably thinking of himself as big-hearted because that's more than double what the spiritual leaders of his time suggested. They told him they get 3, the 4th they're out. So Simon Peter, thinking he's being gracious. I mean, I'll times it times 2 and add 1. How many times should we forgive him, Jesus, Master, Rabbi? Like up to 7 times? And then Jesus is like, no. Here's Simon Peter's mistake. He's still looking for a limit. He's still doing the legalistic thing of, I want the opportunity to calculate the sins of my brother or sister. And so I want to add them up. I want to hold them against them. And Jesus says, nope, not 7 times, but 77. And sometimes people say the Greek could be interpreted as 70 times 7. And so Simon Peter's probably thinking, 77? Like, man, how am I going to keep track of that? That is, like, I'm going to have to get a really nice, notebook or journal. I'm going to have to create a spreadsheet to log the days. Like, that is so much to keep track of. But Jesus is really, his point with this is that it's unlimited. Like 77, that isn't even literal. Or 70 times 7. The point is, my followers should always forgive. This is what he's saying. My follower, it's a countless number of times. Countless. I mean, we're not counting, okay? It's without limit. And so whenever a painful situation pops up in your mind, or whenever that person says the thing that they keep saying, and maybe you've even reminded them and you've created a boundary, I'm asking you not to say the thing again, okay? And they do it again, and you're like, oh, how many times? Man, I need a WhackaMole strategy because this thing just keeps popping up. And I've got, this memory from the past. Not only he or she keeps doing it, there's this memory from the past maybe. I need a WhackaMole strategy for forgiveness. And otherwise, let me put it this way. Jesus teaches us to make forgiveness a habit. To make forgiveness a reflex, meaning that when this painful thing comes to my mind or it's done again, that means I'm starting in the path again. And to make forgiveness a habit means I am creating a new destination on where my mind goes, right? I'm taking out the machete and I've got to forge a new pathway in my brain, a new groove, a new neural template that will become a highway. Why do you have to forgive continually? Well, there's a couple of reasons and options that you could, of course, interpret Jesus to be meaning here of this forgiving 77 times. It could be because sometimes people sin against you consistently. Like the same person keeps doing the same thing, right? Like this just keeps happening and they just keep saying or doing this thing to me. It's regular, repeatedly, constantly. So I have to forgive continually just to keep up with their frequency, right? But the other option is also, it could be sometimes people sin against us colossally. Like it might be one and done, but it was something done to you as a child or in your teenage years or in a relationship. And it's so colossal that it pops up in your mind, and you have to deal with it with a whack-a-mole strategy. Like, it pops up, this one thing that happened, I have to forgive that limitless amount of times, 70 times 7 amount of times, because it so hurt me so badly. And so there's different, and then there's both. You know, someone sins against me continually and colossally. That happens too. This happened to me, and repeatedly. And so I have to forgive limitlessly. And so I want to add to a list that we started at week 1. What is forgiveness not? Well, I think one thing we can add to the list of what forgiveness is not is that forgiveness is not this, it's not this, it's not that. And one thing you can add is forgiveness is not a one-time event. Often the case is, especially the deeper the wound, forgiveness is not a one-time event. It's something you have to do continually. You have to forgive your brother. No, it's 77 times or 70 times 7. You just don't keep count. You keep forgiving. You create a habit, a reflex to forgive. This time of year in Northeast Ohio, if you were to leave a bucket of water outside your door, it would freeze at the top overnight. And you could go out and you could break that up, but you go to bed the next night, what's going to happen? There's going to be another layer of ice at the top of that bucket. And that's going to keep happening because it's cold outside, and it will happen over and over. You have to keep breaking the ice. So in the same way, you have to keep forgiving. You have to keep breaking the ice as it forms because, man, I'm telling you, the world is a cold, cold place. I mean, even the people that love you the most are imperfect, and they're going to hurt you with things that they say or do. And the world is a cold place, and so your heart is like a bucket of water sitting out in the cold. If you don't keep breaking the ice every time it begins to form, your heart will grow hard. It will become so hard. That's why you have to keep breaking the ice. It's like every morning, God's mercies are fresh and new, and you have to offer that to other people and break the ice. I mean, do you know of anybody who stopped breaking the ice? Do you know anyone who has allowed their heart to become hard? Everybody's got one. They can conjure up that aunt, you know, whatever, like, oh, man. Like, she has just become hardened. She eventually chose to stop forgiving people. She quit, and she is so bitter, and it's out of hurt. It's not like she's just a mean, angry person. But then when she chose to stop forgiving, she just became so hard and so cold. And man, everybody's got kind of that person that they can picture, like that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like to let your heart freeze over. Man, and then it's like all they have then is their career. This is all I need. This is what I find satisfaction. Or all they have is their pets. This is all I've got. It's just me and my cats. It's just me and my dog, or whatever it is. Or it's just me and Netflix. Like, and that's what it ends up looking like. Like, is that what you want to end up becoming? Or do you want to say, I got to forgive my brother or sister 77, just limitlessly. I got to keep breaking that ice. I got to do the whack-a-mole strategy. I got to deal with this and create new highways and new pathways. My favorite book series of all time is called The Wheel of Time. It's by the late Robert Jordan. Yes, that is worthy of applause for the 3 nerds in this room. Yes, power to the nerds. Okay, so Wheel of Time, and it just became, for the first time, a series on Amazon. And so I remember reading this book. There are 14 books, not counting the prequel. There are 14 books that are all like 700 to 1,000 pages long. This is nerd stuff, man, but it's so good. It's high fantasy. And so there is one character described in the book. There's a lady, Aes Sedai. I'm not even going to explain what that is. But there's a lady, Aes Sedai, and she's described this way. She buried her hates in shallow graves, if at all. That is a person who knows how to keep a good grudge, right? That she buried her hates in shallow graves, if at all. She keeps a good grudge, and, you know, she barely hides it, if at all. That's the kind of person that everybody knows, ooh, watch out for him, watch out for her. They have chosen to be bitter in life. They have chosen to withhold forgiveness. And I just want you to imagine for a moment, if we don't follow Jesus' advice, imagine a world that doesn't forgive. Imagine a world where no one forgives. Even as a microcosm, if you're like, I can't even picture that. Imagine a family where no one extends grace or forgiveness. Imagine a church where no one extends, no one is gracious. Everyone remembers everything you have ever done to hurt them, everything you've said, you were always reminded of it. Forgiveness is always withheld. That person that you can always count on to be the breath of fresh air in the room, they're bitter, they're cold. There's no refreshing oasis of a person anywhere. Everyone remembers. They keep a record of wrongs, the opposite of what love is in 1 Corinthians 15. They choose to keep a log, a spreadsheet. They keep a record of wrong of everything. Imagine that world. Imagine that family. Imagine that church. And that's what happens if we don't continually break the ice and do the whack-a-mole thing that I'm going to deal with these every time they pop up. And here's kind of a clue for you. If you see a pattern within yourself of, man, I've started to cut people out of my life. I've been living in fear of getting close to people. I've been keeping myself at a distance and being guarded. That is probably a good sign that there is unforgiveness somewhere in your heart, that it's popped up somewhere and you haven't hit it on the head. You haven't been mindful to work on it. There's unforgiveness somewhere. So we have to forgive constantly, continually forgive. C.S. Lewis, my favorite author especially, I love his nonfiction stuff. He says this, the feeling of resentment must simply be killed. I do not mean that anyone can decide this moment that he will never feel it anymore. Those things are going to pop up. That's not how things happen. I mean that every time it bobs its head up, day after day, year after year, all our lives long, we must hit it on the head. It is hard work, but the attempt is not impossible. So this is whack-a-mole forgiveness. He's saying every time we have to hit it on the head. Every time we have to deal with it. Every time we have to break the ice. We have to do this constantly. This is whack-a-mole forgiveness. He says every time it pops up. And he says all of our lives. This isn't just you. This is me. This is everyone. When there's something continual or colossal that goes on in our lives, then we have to deal with it day after day, year after year, all of our lives. And it's not impossible, but it is hard work. It is something you have to stay at. Even when you say, last week I decided, I'm going to forgive this person, I'm going to release them. That doesn't mean the memories won't still pop up from the stuff they did, the stuff they said, the ways that they injured you. It still will. So this is a decision to say, I won't let these Hebbian memory networks lead me down a negative path every time. I won't ruminate over this over and over, nurse and rehearse these painful memories. I won't do that. I'm going to take out the machete and I'm going to forge a new path. And that is hard work, just like C.S. Lewis says it is. So what are we going to do? Let's get really practical. This is how we drop the F-bomb and say, I release, but as these memories pop up, I'm going to continue to forgive in those moments. This person that I've already said, I'm going to forgive them and release them. How do you forgive continually? How do you create new neural pathways and grooves in your brain? So I'm going to teach you what my counselor taught me in 2020. His advice to me was, I kind of ended with like, okay, what does he mean for me in my situation? And I came up with a way that I created, this is what I think he means for me. So I had to go back to him this last week and say, remind me, what were your tips to me that led me to this conclusion? And he reminded me, 3 steps for dealing with painful thoughts. First, identify the thought or the trigger. Why did this come to mind? This painful memory popped up in the past. Why did it come to mind? And it might just be I saw something that made me think of a guy I used to work with, and that made me sad or it made me anxious. This is why it popped into my mind. The second is allow yourself to mourn it. This is really, really important, okay? Allow yourself to feel it for a moment, because that kind of helps. If I can kind of put together the science here, that gets you onto that pathway. That still, when you feel the painful memory, you still feel the hurt, the shame, the anxiety, the stress, whatever it is, it starts you down that path again. But remember, you want that path to end differently, right? So you allow yourself to feel it for a moment. Don't disregard your emotions because that's dangerous. That's what we talked about in week 1, the beach ball being pushed down, trying to hold it underwater. Nope, it's going to pop out. So it's terribly dangerous to stuff or to try to ignore your feelings. So allow yourself to feel it for a moment and don't disregard your emotions. Then, number 3, replace it with the truth. Now, this is super important. Preferably something scriptural. And if you don't know any scripture, you're new to this whole Jesus thing and Bible thing, ask a spiritual mentor, what we call a Batman. Ask him, what is a scripture that I could replace this with? What is something that I could speak to myself that's from Scripture that's true instead of what I feel? And one of the things, and this is the way that I took this, I'll tell you what mine was, but one of the things is extending grace to the other person and saying, I'm going to choose to forgive. I'm going to take out the machete and I'm going to head this direction instead of opening the bottle of wine, instead of acting out in anger and yelling. I'm going to go this direction. It's going to end in forgiveness. And so my counselor told me, this is so important, it's how you end those thoughts that matters. So you allow yourself to feel the pain of that moment, to mourn it, but how you end that thought. It isn't, I'm not going to think about that. Bam, 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 I'm not going to think about it. It's where you end that. Hebs Axiom. The neurons that fire together, they're going to wire together. So you want to create a new pathway that goes in a different direction. I'm going to forgive my brother 77 times, limitlessly, so that I create a highway that when painful things happen to me, my default is, ouch, that hurt, but I got to forgive. Ouch, that hurt, dang, that hurt. Man, that memory hurts, but I got to forgive. And that begins to be the pathway that you create. So for me, my example is this. I use this in my own thought life, that whenever that person that hurt me, and there's different people have hurt me, but whenever a person that's hurt me pops into my mind, or a painful memory from one of those occasions, and those memories that pop up, I'd say, if I didn't deal with this, if I didn't work on this, in unforgiveness, I would think, man, I trusted and sacrificed for that person, and they really screwed me over. Like, I gave and gave, and they really screwed me over. Now, that's how I could just end it, just end angry, just leave the thought. But I'm trying to create a new pathway. So I would identify the trigger. Oh, man, there was something that reminded me of that person, because we used to have this whole old inside joke or something like that. Something triggered it. Oh, that's what it was. I saw this place, and I had coffee with them there once, or something like that. And then the second is to allow myself to feel it. I think, man, that really stinks. Like, I will miss that friendship, or I will miss that relationship. But it's super complicated, and honestly, I just have to cut my losses. And then the third, replace it with the truth. And this is where, in my mind, anytime that painful memory would pop up, I'd allow myself to mourn it. And here's how I would end it. I chose to end it with grace for that person and grace for myself. Because early on, when I first, maybe the first or second session with my counselor, he was asking me, how do you deal with, you have a tough conversation you have to have with somebody. And I told him I've got this document that's full of like all these scriptures that deal with having difficult conversations. And I read through that just to remind myself of how, as a follower of Jesus, do I want to deal with this conversation, to go in humbly, to go in asking questions, to not assume that I know all the story, all that stuff. And he asked me, do you give yourself any grace in these situations? And I was like, I think I do. I think I'm pretty gracious with myself. But in this process, I thought, you know what? I'm going to take that to mind, and I'm going to not just extend grace to them, but I'm going to extend grace to myself also. And so I would think for that person, man, when that painful memory pops up, that hurts. Man, that really did hurt. It is what it is, though. And I would think that person, it's really a great person. And this person was just doing the best with what they know and with what they have. And I know that person has a history of hurt that I think is connected to what ended up happening in our situation because of some past hurt that they have that I know about. And so I think that's why our situation played out the way that it did. And then, after grace for them, I end with grace for me. And I would think, man, I honestly think I did a really good job handling that whole situation. And that would be the grace for me. And then, like we talked about last week, I would typically end by saying a short prayer for that person by name and asking God to bless them and wishing them well. And that's where the path ends. And so now it has, anytime I practice this for a few days and I'm diligent about it and I take out my machete or I take out my mallet, it's not just, bam, get away, get it out of my mind. This is the path that I want to create so that when painful memories pop up, I am heading now in this direction. And sometimes it's automatic, but man, it really helps deal with the painful memories. Every time it pops up, I'm trying to trailblaze a new highway of forgiveness in my brain. 2 weeks ago, Clarence Hogan was a guest speaker here. And you can remember, if you were here, one of the ways he said that he's doing this. He didn't even know this, but the third step, he talked about how he's trying to give the benefit of the doubt to his absent father. Remember how he said, I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt that maybe he didn't have a father. Maybe he didn't have a good father, so therefore he didn't know how to be a good father. And that was a way that he was extending grace and trying to replace with the truth that anger and that hurt. Or it might be this for you, for different situations. For instance, replacing it with the truth might mean this for you. Those words, that event, that hurt, and it wasn't okay that it happened, but I no longer want to let that event or those words define me or make me feel insert emotion. Or I'm no longer that helpless child or girl or young man or woman. I have a choice, and God is both my provider and my protector. That's replacing it with the truth. Or God says I'm worth so much more than that event, that incident, that behavior. He calls me his beloved, his chosen, his child. You're replacing it with the truth. And I'm telling you, once you get in a practice of doing this, it takes 10 or 20 seconds. Anytime a painful memory pops up to say, I'm going to deal with that and I'm going to forge a new highway, it takes like 10 or 20 seconds to say, this is how I hit the mole on the head. This is how I deal with this. Now, there are two trailblazing strategies that you can use to kind of create this path. And I'll tell you this real quick. One is situationally. Just anytime it randomly pops up, you're on a walk, you're riding in the car, boom, it pops up situationally. And you just say, okay, here's how I'm going to do. I'm going to do that 3-step thing, and I'm going to end well, okay? That is kind of the idea of we're taking every thought captive. I'm taking this captive. I'm going to be obedient to Christ with this thought, and I'm going to head down this new highway. And then the other way is, by the way, you can't stop the trigger. Triggers are going to come. Even if you've chosen to forgive that person, you're still going to have memories pop up and things trigger them. The other way is to say, I'm going to do this consciously. And consciously means I am going to sit down or take a moment or go on a walk or whatever it is, and I'm going to actually purposefully practice in advance. I'm going to bring those thoughts, those memories to the surface, and I'm going to practice those new pathways of forgiveness right now. I'm going to do that thing. And I remember that coworker, and they spread rumors about me, and then I say, I'm going to allow myself to feel that hurt for a moment, and I'm going to practice forgiveness. So you can just practice it and begin to create that pathway. And obviously you have more control over that, but there's going to be times you're going to have to do it situationally also. It's the same as sports. You know, we practice in advance what we want to do so that it becomes more of a natural reflex, so that when the situation or game time happens, then it's more natural that we head that direction or respond in that right way when the memory is triggered. And that's what Scripture would kind of say is, man, when God's Spirit lives in you and you're working together with God's Spirit to forgive someone, you are transformed by the renewing of your mind. I mean, God knows Hebs Axiom. He created your neurons that when they fire together, they wire together. So he tells you 7 times, no, you're going to need a highway here. You're going to need to forgive nonstop, continuously, over and over. You're going to need to create a highway from pain to forgiveness, from pain to truth, from pain to grace for you and that other person. And this is hard work, but it is so much better than the alternative. It's to say, this is what it looks like for life, to break the ice, and to stay a gracious person. Christian psychiatrist Kurt Thompson says this: Back to that book. While it's true that established neural networks are most likely to fire, it's equally true that recent research demonstrates that our brains were created with beautiful and mysterious plasticity. That means our neurons can be redirected in ways that correlate with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. He says instead of automatically following the wired sequence of our old memory, with reflection, we can choose to create new pathways. God is eager for us to retrace our neural pathways to eventually take a different route and create a new end to our story. Remember, my counselor said, it's how you end those thoughts. It's really, really important. The late Lewis Smedes, who I mentioned last week, renowned Christian theologian, ethicist, we're sending out an article in the weekly email at noon today. I really highly suggest read this article by him. It's really, really insightful. But he says one of those action steps or inner responses that's involved in forgiveness is something called spiritual surgery. And it relates so much to what we're talking to, but I think it's also really helpful if you're still in the relationship with the person. Maybe you love them. Maybe they're your child. Maybe you're married to them. I think it's really helpful for this. He says, when you forgive someone, you slice away the wrong from the person who did it. You disengage that person from their hurtful act. You recreate them. He said, you think of them now not as the person who hurt you, but as a person who needs you. Once you branded them as a person powerful and evil, but now you see them as a person weak in their needs. You recreated your past by recreating the person whose wrong made your past painful. They have been altered by spiritual surgery. This takes work and it takes practice, but that is what a life of continual forgiveness looks like. And the cool thing about that is that's exactly what God's done for us, right? Like, instead of simply seeing us as evildoers and rebels and human beings who have committed spiritual treason against him, he sees us as desperate people who need him. He loves the sinner, not the sin, as the old saying goes. So he hates sin rather than hating you or hating me for my sin. And when we put faith in Christ because of what he did on the cross, then God covers us with amazing grace. And God separates the wrong from the wrongdoer, and he disengages us from our hurtful acts. It's like he performs a spiritual surgery, and he separates us from our sin. As far as the east is from the west, so far as he removed our transgressions from us. And then he recreates us. He makes us a new creation. He changes our identity. And God doesn't limit how many times he'll forgive you or me when we're covered by the grace of Jesus. He says, I will forgive you a limitless number of times in my grace for you because your sin has already been paid for by Jesus on the cross. So therefore, we should not limit how many times we will forgive others. Let me just close with this. When I was young in the ministry, I used to think, man, there's two big things that often were assigned to me when I would have conversations with people about how serious they were about wanting to surrender to Jesus. Maybe they were a follower of Jesus, and they were like, I want to grow as a disciple, a student, apprentice of Jesus. But there would often be two big things that would pop up. And it was often their sex life and their money. I want to follow Jesus, but I'm going to sleep with whoever I want to sleep with. I want to follow Jesus, but he ain't touching my budget. And so I would be like, man, those are often going to be the let's dig into this conversation. Man, these are going to be tough. This is something that is this is the God of it. I talked to a guy one time, he was a single guy that I was really good friends with, and I said, what is the thing that keeps you from becoming a follower of Jesus? And he said, what keeps me from following Jesus is when I have a girlfriend, I like to go away to Cancun and get away for the weekend, and I don't want Jesus ruining that. I was like, well, that's honest. He knows what stands between him and Jesus. He doesn't want to let Jesus speak into his sex life. So he's like, I don't want Jesus because he's going to ruin my weekends with whatever girlfriend I have. Another time I was talking to a lesbian woman who said, I could give up having sex with other women. I could absolutely choose a life of celibacy, but I'm a greedy son of a gun. She was like, I don't want God touching my money. So she was like, okay, it's not so much the sex thing for me, it's the money thing. But the more that I talk to people, the more I realize there's a third one. It's actually a trifecta. And the third one is your bitterness. Will you let God speak into your bitterness? Will you let him tell you, if I'm going to give grace to you, you have to give grace to others? And I urge you, man, take a big next step in your spiritual journey if you haven't already, to say, I'm going to take my hurt, my brokenness, my pain, all this, and I'm going to lay them at the feet of Jesus and let him tell me what to do with my bitterness. And I will release the one who hurt me from whatever debt I think they owe me. When I do that, I will release the power of God into my life. And ultimately, that forgiveness releases you whenever you drop the F-bomb. And then you can say, okay, what's my next step in discipleship of following Jesus? Now that I'm covered by his grace, my next step, it might be your money, it might be your sex life, or it might be something totally different, but then you can move on to the next thing that God wants to speak to you about. Let's watch this video.